And now, as our guest speaker, uh, he's known throughout Middleboro and our church as yes, infamous, famous. You take your pick. But Jeff is going to talk to us about some of the history of our town. And as you know, it's rather old and extensive. So please welcome Jeff and
Who's old and expensive? What? No.
yeah, well, we're all old. But he's not the ancient one. So
Thank you all. Nice to have you here with us. Um, Middleboro, I think, as we obviously have just heard and all know already, goes way, way back as far as American history goes. And actually, if you get involved with the native people, you'll find out that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of more years that are part of Middleboro's history, too, than the Native American folks that came here. It seems most of the time that as you talk about anything involving American history, it seems as if nothing starts around here until what? What's the thing that is most often the starting event of 1620? And 1620 being, of course, the time that the Pilgrims came along and settled in Plymouth. Now, my understanding is they were really trying to head down to Virginia, but they were so sick to death of being on the Mayflower that they bumped into Cape Cod and then went along and, of course, discovered that there was a wonderful area of cleared land that was there. Basically, what they were finding was a native village where everyone had been wiped out by the diseases that were spread by the traders and fishermen and fur folks who were collecting furs from the animals along the coastline. And unfortunately, the Europeans went up and down the coast and wiped out the coastal native populations in many, many cases. And Plymouth is a perfect example of that. Now, the Pilgrims came along and discovered basically cleared land. And because unlike what most of us think about the native population, most of us think they go out and just hunted and gathered. Well, they also grew crops and had corn and other things so they would clear land and then raise crops on that, and was all part of having a successful native village in those days. But diseases brought by the early traders spread around the traders and trappers and fishermen that came along the coast. The Pilgrims, as I say, were originally headed to Virginia, but were so sick to death of being on the Mayflower that they stayed right there and started growing crops. And natives welcomed them. Squanto was, of course, famous, and what was his comments to them? Do you remember what he said? No, was not there. Up comes this young brave, very much obviously a Native American, and said, "Welcome, Englishmen." Now, guess why he could say "Welcome, Englishmen"? He had spent 2 years in England basically as a slave, I believe, and then I don't know why he was brought back here, but anyhow, he was learned English with that. So Squanto had lived for 2 years in England and spoke English. Pilgrims, as they settled into Plymouth, did then go out and visit the closest native village that existed, and it existed in a place called Nemasket. Guess what we now call it? This is Middleboro. So, the closest native population of any size to the Pilgrims was right here. And with that, Nemasket, by the way, means place of fish. And because it was, the river was a dominant factor in the farming that went along, that the native people were doing, and all the things that happened along that area. So Nemasket meaning place of fish. The Pilgrims then interacted well with those native people at first. Unfortunately, there were things that happened along the way, and the Pilgrims entered into agreements with the native people in which the native people thought they were sharing land with the Pilgrims. Guess what the Pilgrims thought was happening? They were selling the land to them as they felt. And with that, along came some very, very horrendous times in history. And so with the purchase of land, there was a major purchase called 26 Man's Purchase, where 26 Pilgrim men bought land from the native people that were here in Nemasket. And with that, the Indians expected them to come and to share the land with them. Instead, guess what the Pilgrims wanted them to do? Move out and turn over all that land to them. So out of this was the beginning of what ended up being really some of the most horrendous things that came. And from this came an event that is by and large considered to be the most destructive, quote, war that America ever had as far as its impact on the people of the day. And guess what that was? See, I don't know why I'm talking to you guys. You know everything already. King Philip's War came along. King Philip being a name of the native chief. He assumed name as if he were British, which he was not. But King Philip was the native chief of the time. And so it's called King Philip's War. And it went on for about a year and a half. And this is in the 1670s, 1675 and 1676. It was an absolute disaster for the native people. Any idea why they would have such difficulties? There was one thing that the Pilgrims had that the native people didn't, especially, and that was firearms, guns, and other things. Now, I tell you this, this leads to one of my favorite pieces of history in Middleboro, and it has to do with the Middleboro sign about something that happened in King Philip's War. And you folk go by it day after day after day and may or may not know of its existence. Yes, yes. Mark is correct. If you go by what used to be the historic high school of town, then became, when I was teaching in it, the junior high school of town, then became actually the kindergarten school of town. It still is at the old high school. There's a historic marker there. And I want to think that we're probably the only town in the area, or perhaps in the country, that has a historic marker to an obscene gesture. But only Middleboro, what can I say? Only Middleboro. And here's what happened. Things were getting stressed and strained over the problem with the early British settlers in this area who went through things like 26 Man's Purchase, where they purchased land. That they felt then allowed them to completely control what happened there. The native folks thought they were sharing the land more than they were giving it away or selling it or whatever it is. So with that, there got to be more and more and more stresses and strains between the two groups. The British folks who were living here had what was not, we wouldn't call it a fort. Plymouth had a fortress with high walls and everything else. Middleboro didn't have anything like that. But they did have a home that was really right where the school is right there, that was kind of acting as their safety location. And where there were also people with guns and other things to help protect it. So with that, the beginning of King Philip's War came along, and every building were, well, let me finish off. There were about 600 white settlers died during King Philip's War, not just here in Middleboro by any means, because this was all of southeastern Massachusetts and up into New Hampshire, and so this spread and became, again, what is considered in some cases one of the most disastrous impacts on any war on the local population, because it did happen right in this area, and the local population had some serious impacts with about 600 local white settlers who died. No idea how many native people died, but probably considerably more than the 600 whites who died during this. At that point, every single building in Middleboro was burned down. Now, the folks who were living here kind of knew things were going poorly for them, and so their solution was to pick up and go back to Plymouth. Plymouth. So everybody left Middleboro, left their wooden houses that they had built, and every single house in Middleboro was burned down. The war, this King Philip's War, named after the chief of the day, lasted just about 2 years. In southeastern Massachusetts and up into New Hampshire, about 13 towns were destroyed, and many others were attacked. Yes, Eddie?
Before we leave, you mentioned the obscene gesture. What was that all about?
Well, I don't think I need to give it to you right now, but it involved a single finger that was raised and flashed across the river because at the time things were going badly. The British folks were all in this fortified house that was on where now the kindergarten school is. Fields were around there. You could see the river. Now the river was 3 or 4 times bigger than it is now. But over there on the hill, which was cleared for farming, was a big stone, and a native brave stood there and was giving obscene gestures. Now, I want to think that we probably have the earliest American historic marker to obscene gestures of anything in the whole country. So, again, Middleborough has unique ways of standing out. But he giving on obscene gestures over here on this side of the river was a man who was considered the best shot in town. Somebody else had the best rifle in town and put the best rifle and the best shot together, and guess what he did? Took a shot and killed the brave, who supposedly falling down put his hand on a rock, and on the rock is supposedly an outline of his hand. Now, I don't know how that ever happened, and I've never been over to see where it is, but the rock is still there. But again, I think we're unique. How many towns can brag about an obscene gesture from the 1600s and some of these events? So that's King Philip's War. It was an absolute disaster for the native people of New England. The braves who survived were rounded up and sent into slavery in the Caribbean in most cases. The women often became indentured servants to the families that came back and rebuilt their houses and took back the land and all the things that went with it. So, as I say, I always take some pleasure in knowing that we're probably the only town in not just the state of Massachusetts, but perhaps in the whole country that has a historic marker to an obscene gesture. But that's Middleborough once again. 1669, as we move along in Middleborough's history, Middleborough was allowed to become a separate town from Plymouth, because in all those times from the 1620s through the to 1669, so that's basically we'll call it 1670, that's 50 years worth of time. All of the land in Middleborough had people living on it who had come from Plymouth, and it was during that time part of Plymouth. But there was a hope to become a separate town. Who knows what you had to have in order to be a separate town in colonial days? 2 things. 2 things. No, well, it took money to have these things, but church is one thing, an official town church. Central Congo was the central church for Middleborough at that time. It already existed, so Central Congo. No. Yes, Church of the Green. What else, though? You were supposed to have a militia. Guess what? Middleborough didn't have a militia. So they should have been turned down by the colonial government. Now, the only reason they got away with this is that the farmers who were willing to be in the militia, because that's what made up the militia, where local men who owned a rifle would get together regularly and drill a little bit and become a little bit capable of protecting the community and all those kinds of things. So, but Middleborough men who wanted to be in the militia went to Plymouth, because we were at that point part of Plymouth. Because we at least had militia people who were going to a militia, Middleboro was allowed to become a separate community. So you'll see on our paperwork about the town of Middleboro, 1669 is when we were incorporated with those two things, an official town church, that town church being the central one that's still there. That's the third or fourth building that has been in that spot down there. And also we then had our own town militia. So we got that in 1669. We separated and became a separate town, and we covered all of the things that went with that. Yes.
I know that at that point, Middleboro included Lakeville.
Yes.
Did it include any other land?
I wouldn't be at all.
Repeat the question, Jeff?
The question is whether or not Mark is correct in saying that Middleboro was a massive area, so much bigger than most typical towns, in that we had all of the Lakeville lakes and all of the Lakeville land, as well as what we think of as Middleboro. And you know, he was wondering whether or not there were very many other places like that, I gather.
No.
Right, what do you say?
Was Middleboro any larger than Middleboro and Lakeville?
I'm not really sure.
Lakeville was West Middleboro.
Yes, yes. So in those days, it was called West Middleboro, not just plain Middleboro. It had just like we have East Middleboro and North Middleboro, and they were West Middleboro during that time. 1669, later the Middleboro militia was created, and its members fought in the Revolutionary War. So by the time that the Revolutionary War came along, Middleboro did have a militia, and they fought in the American Revolution. Central Congo was in the official town church at that time. With the outbreak of the American Revolution in the 1770s, a very special person became, quote, an American hero. Deborah Sampson, okay? Deborah Sampson, first of all, was not born in Middleboro. Deborah Sampson was born in our right next door town, and I'm going to have trouble coming up with it. Plimpton. Father was a farmer, but unfortunately for her family, her father died. The family was in tough shape and other things. Anyway, Deborah Sampson was sent to be an indentured servant in Middleboro, but she had some very unusual abilities. First of all, she was an incredible seamstress, considered to be the best seamstress in all of Middleboro at the time. So that was one special thing. But on top of that, she was an incredibly good shot with a rifle and all those kinds of things. Came to Middleboro, worked in a number of different houses. At this point, she, however, then became very much interested in whether or not she could somehow or other find a way to support the American Revolution that happened in the 1770s. Now, fairly quickly, apparently there was some reaction to any possibility of her becoming a soldier. So her solution was to cut her hair, put on pants, leave town, and go to some other nearby town, which she did do, and ended up applying and apparently never being detected from that application time that she was indeed female. And then she spent 2 to 3 years in the Army, masquerading as a man during all of that time. Now, she ended up even having 1 or 2 injuries. She fought in a number of battles, supposedly dug a musket ball out of her bosom one time when she was wounded. All of that, and she managed to stay separate from that. Let me see. She was also one of the things I failed to mention before she ended up being a hero with us in the Army. She was also a school teacher for several months in Middleboro, and so before she joined the Revolutionary War. So she enlisted in Medfield as Robert Shirtliff, and also she had also under another false name been Timothy Thayer. She ended up being aide-de-camp to several generals because of her incredible ability in reading and writing, which many people, of course, who in that day and age weren't as capable. So she was just an amazing person when it came to hiding her gender and working with this. She was an aide-de-camp to several generals, including George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. So she was really an amazing woman. Now, end of the war, came back to Middleboro, guess what? They were embarrassed by her. Made it so that she was uncomfortable. And so she left town, went to some other nearby towns, and ended up marrying a farmer in Sharon. Unfortunately for her, her farmer husband died after a little while. She had several children. And with that, things got again pretty desperate for her. She had trouble keeping the farm going and taking care of the children and all that. Someone rode to her rescue in this and got her pension for having been a soldier in the Revolutionary War. Can anybody guess who might have rode to her rescue? Paul Revere. Paul, yes, it was. Paul Revere was a neighbor and was, willing to recognize the wonderful service that she had provided, and with that got her pension, and she lived out her life. Her pension, by the way, was a very generous one for the day, $48 a year. While our Middleboro girl was an American hero, Middleboro also housed a very famous American Tory. Who was the famous American Tory who lived in Middleboro? He was born in Boston, basically in a family that was very much part of the Tory government of the time. He went to Harvard, got his attorney credentials, became the Attorney General of the colony of Massachusetts, all of that. Now, I don't know how he ever discovered the wonderful resource river, because actually the river in those days were 3 to 4 times the size that it is now. Okay, this is the days before there were any dams and things up in the Lakeville Lakes, and much more water ran down. And so this was a incredible resource of power, because for powering any factories in those days, they needed something that would be able to create motion and all that kind of stuff, and moving water was perhaps the best. And so he created Oliver Mill with about 8 or 10 undershot water wheels. And it was considered at the time about as big a factory as it was in all of the colony of Massachusetts. So again, Middleboro keeps popping up as kind of having a special role in some way. At the same time, he built an incredible house at the top of the hill right above where his mill was. And it was considered perhaps the most impressive both land site but also building in all of the colonies of the New World for the British. So it was, again, an incredible location. He would drive into town in a carriage drawn by 6 horses with outriders waving flags, doing all kinds of things. So he was very much considered the most powerful and impressive man in town. He had a son who was raised here in town. His son went to Harvard but became a medical doctor. The son, when he was up in Boston going to Harvard to become a medical doctor, fell in love with the Attorney General of Massachusetts' daughter and married her. Peter Oliver, the father, because they were both named Peter Oliver, the father, gave him land and built him a house that is still there. Okay, and it's very interesting. If you ever haven't gone over and visited the house, go through it. It's a beautiful house. So anyway, so the son was a medical doctor and started practicing here in Middleboro was not terribly well received, because it was clear where the Olivers were very much in favor of the British government, while the native population of Middleboro was very much into the revolution. And so there was a lot of kind of stresses and strains. Halfway through the revolution, a mob went and banged on Dr. Peter Oliver's house and told him that he had a choice. He could load up anything he could carry in a cart that they provided, or he had, or something or other, and leave with his wife and his children, because there were a couple of children there too, or he could stay overnight there and then watch them burn his house down the next morning. He decided to go to Boston, so so he loaded up and went. And basically, Middleboro was very much in favor of the revolution from that point. So, but the Olivers both went up to Boston, stayed there until there was something that kicked all the British sympathizers out of Boston, which was Evacuation Day. Evacuation Day is... What happened was, there was I think his name was Henry Knox, a guy who was a baker, I think, or something or other, in Boston, but he became involved with the revolutionary forces. They won some kind of a battle up around the Great Lakes. With that, he knew Boston was still full of British sympathizers and British troops, so that Boston was completely off limits to the Revolutionary War forces. You could only get on there with a little peninsula to connect the main part of Boston City to the mainland. So this guy decided that he was going to bring the cannon from a fort that was up there, and he got oxen and dragged them in the middle of the winter across Vermont and across New Hampshire and down through part of Massachusetts, and put them on the heights of Dorchester. With that, he then told the British that if they didn't get out, he was going to start bombarding the city. Because Dorchester Heights were so much above the city, there was no way the British could refire at them at that point. And so with that, along comes a holiday we still celebrate every year, named
St. Patrick's Day.
Evacuation Day. So anyway, that's it. And with that, the Olivers went to Canada, and then I think Nova Scotia, as a matter of fact. And then after a little while there, went to England. Didn't do terribly well in England, and that was the end of that aspect of the family. So, American Revolution. Here was Bradford teenager who became involved in the Middleboro family. Our hero was okay. I've covered all this. Was a school teacher. Revolution. We're talking about our. Famous American Tory. We talked about Peter Oliver.
Jeff?
Yep.
What did they manufacture at the mill?
They manufactured all kinds of things. Shovels, for one thing. Okay. But also there were even cannonballs that have been found that were manufactured by them. Nails, a whole batch of stuff. There were a whole batch of things. Thank you, Edward. A whole batch of stuff that they produced. A lot of it metal. There were because around there were forests. They could bring melt, and there were what is called bog ore.
Right.
So they could, with that, create iron, and then they could form that iron into things like shovels.
Okay, thank you.
So, and as I say, that was about as big an industrial complex as there was in all of Massachusetts. Sandy, so yes.
Jeff, can you talk about Lavinia? I can't remember the last name.
Of who?
Lavinia.
Lavinia Warren.
Just that- I don't know if that fits in here or not.
Married who? Who'd you say she married?
Get married to Tiny Tim?
Oh, Tom Thumb. Yes. See, now I didn't even bring them in as. I knew I'd left somebody out because I'm about to wrap up here, and I completely forgot about her. And this is Mrs. Tom Thumb. Another piece of Middleboro history is there was a family here in Middleboro, and 2 daughters were born who were what we would have called midgets or dwarfs. Okay, and one of them became on traveling around in the various places that some of those folks did, met Tom Thumb, and they were married. Mrs. Tom Thumb married. The sister stayed here in Middleboro. She had an unfortunate event, and that was that she became pregnant, and but she became pregnant with a full-sized baby that she could not produce, and died during childbirth. So she's buried at Nemasket Hill Cemetery. The sister is, but the other one, Mrs. Tom Thumb, Tom Thumb died, and she was tired of traveling all over the place with the carnivals and other things. So she came back here and married another midget who was here, and I forget his name. Does anybody remember his name? No, it wouldn't be St. Mary's. Okay. Anyway, and they lived here in Middleboro for a while, but I think she moved on after he died. But anyway, another little bit of history.
What were those years?
I don't know exactly. I would have said in the 1880s, 1890s, something in that range. Finally, one way to kind of experience our past, well, first of all, there are some incredible books. This is a quick way to read about Middleboro's history. There's a little bit to our history, and one of these books, the first one covers from 1669, actually talks about things before 1669 through 1905, and then there's another one, Murdy Moraine. That one was written by Tom Weston. And then the second book is from 1905 to 1965, done by Murdy Romaine. So, we're fortunate to have these resources as a way to go back and find out all the things that have happened in this funny little town. So, another way, though, that you can sometimes do this is to visit some of our cemeteries, and we have cemeteries that go back to before they used cemetery stones. They used to have what were called rails, where they would put a person's initials and perhaps a date and mark a grave with a wooden post. Unfortunately, guess what happens to all the wooden posts? They rot and fall over, and that's the end of there. So then they finally started using stone that was local slate, and it's easy to cut, though it isn't terribly good about standing up very long. And along came things like Central Cemetery, which is central right there in the center of what was colonial Middleboro. And it has hundreds of historic stones that go back to the Revolutionary War and before. With our Middleboro history, you can also find the connection of a gravestone to the activities of the person in the Revolution. I found a stone that was made out to John Morton. Now, I didn't know anything about him, and I did a rubbing of this, and I had this. I've unfortunately lost this stone. I can't find it. It's had bright red around it in the last 6 months. I don't know what the heck I've done with it, but it was too bad, because actually I discovered in doing my genealogy that he's like my 9th great-grand uncle or some silly thing like that. He was born in Plymouth. His parents did not come over on the Mayflower, as so often you hear. They came over on the Anne, which is, I think, the 3rd boat in Plymouth. But they were very successful merchants and had money and all that kind of stuff, and educated our friend John here that we're talking about. John wanted to be a school teacher. So he literally built himself a one-room schoolhouse in Plymouth and started teaching school. He had neighbors who wanted to come to school but were poor. Now, in those days, the only people who went to school were people whose parents would pay for them to go to school. He, however, knew some of these neighborhood kids and allowed them to start coming to his school. Guess what that made him in history? He is the very first public school teacher, not only in the town of Plymouth, not only in the colony of Massachusetts, not only in the British colonies of the New World. He is the first public school teacher in both North and South America. Now, I didn't know any of that until I just happened to look him up in the encyclopedia, okay? Now, then, of course, here, I happen to also being around, if you're a Yankee, you have connections to all kinds of people. So I was poking around and discovered branches of my family that came from Plymouth and all that kind of stuff. And guess who I bump into? John Morton. So I'm connected to him, which, being a school teacher, I found was kind of a fun thing to be connected to the first public school teacher in the New World. But it's the kind of thing that you can find in this community. We have so many historic connections and parts of things that connect us in one way or another. And I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to bang through these kinds of things if you want to. It gives you all kinds of information and things to be done. So that's a little look at Middleboro's history. I brought along just a couple of final things because as you go through the cemeteries, you can discover a place where, again, they were, in the day, not allowed to use symbolism. The Puritans, and Middleboro was settled first by Puritans, were absolutely against using symbolic images. In a Puritan church, guess what you would not have found? You would not have found a statue. You would not have found a cross. You would not have found, an image of Jesus on a cross, any of those kinds of things, because they felt that. Now, people with that didn't have any pictures in the houses or any of those other things. For some reason, and I don't quite know why, guess the only place they allowed pictures to be? Cemeteries. And so you can go through and these are an early one. Trying to see if I can read the date. But anyway, here lies the body of Mrs. Sarah Smith, wife to Jonathan Smith. Anyway, at first, early stones almost always had something like this up there. And it's, what do you think it is? No. It's what would be called a death's head. And it is meant to be like a skull. And it is reminding us all of something that we perhaps don't always want to be reminded of, but guess what that is? You're all going to die. So, you better behave yourself because you're going to be having one of these sometime of these times. Okay, so death's heads. And so the very first and the earliest stones would have death's heads. And this one is unusual, and the reason I did a rubbing, because this is a Middleboro stone, what else do you see there?
An English lady with flyaway hair.
No. No, it's not even a willow tree. Those come along later on. What do you think that is?
Oh my God.
No, it's not. First of all, there are two of something or other. Two eyes. Nose, kind of perhaps. This is called by us folks who get into the cemetery stones, this is called a soul and mouth stone. Okay, because guess what is representing? From death, what is released? Soul. So this is the soul being released by death of this person. That's what they think it is. Now, again, they didn't write this stuff down. We just have these images. But at first, there'll be just a skull, maybe skull and crossbones on the earliest stones. This is a little further along in that. I don't remember what year this was, but this is a Middleboro stone. So that kind of thing is among the earliest of stones. Some of these Go to the microphone, okay. And what is the image here? What do you think this is saying to you? What is it saying about the person who's buried here? They went heavenly, okay? They went up to heaven. And so, this is Josiah, son of Mr. James and Mrs. Eunice Soul, died April 3rd. Now, this is 1812, so they've been doing cemetery stones for over 100 years. It's gone from being just a skeletal something or other to now symbols that we're doing otherwise. And so this child was 8 months and 25 days old at that point.
Is that a Soul Homestead relative?
It could well be. I don't know. And what do you think? Well, again, we interpret it, though they didn't write down. It could have been one of two things. It could be setting sun, which would be a representation of death. Or it could be a rising sun, which is resurrection, everlasting life. So there is that kind of thing that comes along. So we have some of these, and it's towards the end of the time when they were using, skull and crossbones and those kinds of things. Then we have ones that are really kind of overboard, but David. No, that's, you take fairly soft paper and tape it on the front of the stone. Now, usually you have to clean the stone off pretty extensively to begin with, because most of our stones have lichens growing on them, all kinds of things. So you have to clean them and hopefully not scrape them in any way, but clean them off. You tape them, then, a flat crayon kind of thing to do. That's green crayon. Usually I use black. And the last one up there is perhaps the biggest and most impressive stone in town. And you can look at it and see, and it tells you who it is and a number of things. This is Sylvanus Conant. He was the minister at the Church in the Green during the American Revolution, okay, and a strong advocate for independence. So the thing that is unusual is that this stone first tells you all kinds of things about it. Now, I find it interesting to see one thing about it, and I'm going to point it out to you. I kept wondering about it. What I think happened here is that, first of all, Middleboro never would have had a big piece of slate as big as this to be used for this. Now, at the same time, guess what other Massachusetts location might very well have big stones like this, because they had many rich people? Where? Up in Boston, okay? Now, and again, for most communities, guess who the most important person in town was? The minister of the church that was the official town church, okay, as he was. So, because if you look at what this is, we've got two angels looking down, and the person who's there, long hair, but collar, tells you what is he? He's the pastor of the church, okay? Now, I think that this is a stone that gets used by any number of communities when their minister of the town's church dies and he's going to go into the town cemetery, as this guy should have. But anyway, in the midst of it all, his first name, Sylvanus, was so long that you couldn't get Conant in there. And I don't think you could get by saying Reverend Silly Conant. That didn't, that wasn't going to work. So anyway, they made something or other, and at least got his name on there, though. Now it goes on and on and on about all those kinds of things. And then it tells you that he's buried 3 miles from here. Now, why is he buried 3 miles from here? During the American Revolution, as often happened in Middleboro, they would have outbreaks of smallpox, okay? They didn't know exactly what caused it, but it happened, and it happened frequently. And with it, they know the only way you could prevent anything bad from happening in the larger community was to isolate those people. So they went to what was often called a pest house. The pest house in this outbreak was out near where Soul Homestead is, okay? And so he went out into a barn that was out there, and a number of people who had it. And when smallpox came into a community, anybody who got it, you had about a 50-50 chance of surviving it. If you survived it, you'd never have smallpox again. You didn't survive it, you went into the cemetery. He didn't survive it, and now, he did not go into this cemetery. He is such an important guy that he got this massive stone. His wife's got a stone right beside him, but he's not buried there. Out at Soul Homestead, if you know anything about along Soul, right a little bit down past where the Soul farm is, there's a very small cemetery on the side that is a smallpox cemetery. And guess who's there? Reverend Sylvanus Conant. So he has another stone where he really is buried. So this is a cenotaph, which is meaning a stone marking where somebody who they wanted to mark that he was important and was a significant part of the community, you know, all those kinds of things, and wanted it up in town right where he is. But he's also got a big stone out there as well. So there's all kinds of things to see. Now, I hang this up in my living room in my house. My mother-in-law, rest her, anyway, took one look at it and says, "What are you going to do? You're going to put my death certificate up there too?" Which I haven't done, but anyway. So we have a town that has so many interesting features to it, and a very, very rich history. And you know, you can find them. I tell you, books like this is a great source of information, and there's all kinds of things that are there. So, any questions or other things? Yes.
I'd just like to also point out there's the Town Historical Society, which has first sourced materials, which they will help you research, and photographs, wonderful displays of all of these parts of history, as well as we are very fortunate across the street to have, and this is on Jackson, the Robbins Archaeological Museum.
How often is that open? I never can find a time when it's open.
Yeah, 2 days a week. And
Friday and
also
Saturday or something or other like that?
Yeah, so it's best to check their websites. But that has the pre-contact
people.
history.
Yeah.
And they're really, really wonderful resources
Are they?
that are
Good.
used by people all over the world. So.
Great. Wonderful. Good. Yes, Edward.
How about the Madigan books?
I'm trying to think about the Madigan books. These are not the Madigan books. These are Tom
they're
Weston.
smaller, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Don't know.
The library has all of those. And our very own Marilyn Thayer wrote a book about Middleboro, also a small paperback one, but well-researched and very, very interesting.
Yeah. I was going to say a fine little story to finish up with, and that had to do with going about, and maybe I actually already told you this story, so I won't have to tell you again. Yeah, I think it was the stone that I discovered was a relative of mine. That yes, yeah, John Morton. So, alrighty. Anything else? Thank you all.
Thank you.
A lot of good stuff. Anytime.